Hi there, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to another track breakdown. This time I'm covering my track Hymn to the Fallen, and I'll link it up there and down there and everywhere. Let's jump straight in. Here's my session. It's quite humble. It's not that big of a project, and that's because the star of the show is the choir. I wrote this track when I had just bought a new choir sample library, which is Insolidus by ADO, and I am absolutely in love with it. To get that out of the way, and now we can start. I've loaded this patch that says Insolidus arc 4 syllables, and this is basically a selection of words divided into 4 syllables, and you can choose a sequence of these words that will be sung by your choir. The nice thing is about this, you have other choir libraries that have words that are pre-sung, let's say. However, when you would switch notes in between, what often happens is you trigger the first note and the word will be sung, and then when you trigger another note, it starts again at the start of the word, so it doesn't sync up. However, with this patch, if I play so when I change the notes or add notes in between, they will start at the point where the word was on that point in time. So this way you can create beautiful phrases and beautiful choir settings with truly sung words, which you can choose yourself from a selection. And I basically exploited this in this track. So I want to start off with doing a full harmonic analysis of what's happening in these choir chords throughout the entire track. So the piece starts in D flat major. And this first part is constructed of something that in classical music it's called a sequence, which is a repetition of a series of chords that go up or down with a set interval. So I also could have played so as you can see, this is a very common motion. It's the bum bum, which you often hear is ending a piece. And I repeat this 3 times. And each time is going up by 1 step. And then in the end, we have a cadential motion in B flat minor, which is the relative minor to D flat major. So in this first section, we have modulated in a very natural way from D flat major to B flat minor, which are 2 keys that are very similar to each other, or they are linked to each other at least. In this whole section, I try to spice things up by adding suspensions here or there. So the first section, always on the second chord of a pair, there is a suspension. And from there it goes on. So with 2 chords from B flat, go to A flat 7th, and that way we have modulated back to D flat major. So this movement is basically 2 times the same movement. So it's a minor third down with a passing tone, and I repeat this from B flat down to G flat. And then finally, to end off the phrase, we end in a cadence in D flat. However, I kept the last chord very open, so you can't tell for sure whether it's a major or a minor chord. Because I kept this last chord so open, I can choose if I want to continue in either major or minor, because the chord isn't defined in one of the two. So here I chose to modulate immediately to C sharp, D flat. Doesn't really matter. It's easier now to say C sharp because of the amount of sharps or flats you use. So from here I now go to C sharp minor. It's again the same movement, and now we do it again, but we go a step down instead of up. So this is basically the same motion that started the piece, but now it's in C sharp minor, and the steps are down instead of up. Suspensions are still there, and the same fourth motion that's going up. This is copied from the downward motion, which is repeated twice, but now it's in E major, which is related to C sharp minor. So this is basically a repetition of what we've heard earlier, but now it's in the new key. And then we continue with some new material. It is new material, but it uses the same principle of the fourth jumps in the bass line. This is some truly new material just after the climax. And then we end. Because we are in E major now, it's related to C sharp minor. So we can make a cadence in C sharp minor with a chord that isn't naturally in E major, but so this transition from A major to G sharp or A flat major seems quite sudden. Because these two keys are so close to each other, related to each other, we can make this sudden swift while it still makes sense. And we are back in D flat. And this last chord I keep open again, so it's still ambiguous if it's a major or a minor chord. Now that we have that out of the way, let's dive into some of the orchestration things I used. So we have the solo choir, but I chose to layer it with two more voices as well. And these are legato patches from the same choir library. The one is playing the melody and the other is playing the bass line. And I chose to use a legato patch here where you could change between the vowels. So you have an A, an E, an U, and etc. And I chose to layer these lines because they are your most important lines, the soprano line and the bass line, your outer voices. And by adding this legato patch to that, so you get a bit more emphasis on the melodies that are going on in the outer voices. And to give some more emphasis to the lower end, I doubled the bass line in a double bass patch and a soft synth patch as well. And that's how you get the full choir sound of the opening. And I want to just dive into the time signatures here very quickly. I alternated between the 6/4 and different other time signatures. So there's a couple of 8/4s here, there's a 3/4, a 7/4. And the reason why I did this is to be able to have some breaks between the chords. So it's not just 6/4, 6/4, 6/4, 6/4, almost robotic in a sense. But there are some natural gaps which vary in length, as if you would have a conductor who takes his time between the chords and just depending on the feeling of the music decides when they start again. So that's why I chose to make these irregular as well, to have different breaks on different parts in the music that I thought were fit in that moment. When I had this choir part for the entire track, basically the next thing that I had to do was, I told myself, was to make it epic. And that's the thing that's happening in the second half of the music. So there you can see I doubled some lines with some violins and a bit of brass. The most important doubling is that the main melody goes to horn legatos, doubled by the cello. Later on, when we reach the climax, I use some trombones to double the chords that are the inner voices, let's say. And when we start reaching the climax, more lines are doubled in higher octaves as well by the trumpets and the violins. And the cello are added on the main melody as well. So this one violin part just plays the higher octave for a couple of notes really. Another thing I added towards the climax part was some pulsating elements in some synth pads and keys. So the first thing you hear of this is a very soft electric piano which starts shimmering in towards the end of the first half. And it's just alternating around the root D flat with C. And what you hear next is basically the movement for the remainder of the piece, but then it's changing between the different chords. And towards the end, what the piece closes off with is the same type of material, but then it's moving around scale of D flat major with some minor seventh in there as well. And that basically was an improvisation I did when I was recording this part. And I liked it so much, I just kept it there. No editing, I just kept it the way it was from this first take I recorded. And the synth pads I used were 3 different kinds. One is coming in from the start of the second half. And this pulsating effect really helps in building towards the climax. And later on, a new one is added. Again with the rhythmic effect. And finally, when we reach the climax, I add one more to the bass line. To really give some emphasis again to the low end when everything is happening at the same time. The percussion I really used to create this bigger than life feeling towards the climax, and I knew this piece doesn't require loads of heavy rhythmical things, but just some big impacts to create some kind of a climax. So I introduced this already quite early as a first introduction to know, there's coming more. And while we start progressing in the piece, more and more of this is added. So also some timpani rolls to add the impact with the pitches that belong to them, and some live recorded cymbal rolls. And the cymbals here, the peak of the line. And that's about all there is to it. So the most important thing for this piece was the harmonic progression and the choir patch I used. And I was just so inspired by this patch. The piece came out pretty naturally. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope the harmonic analysis was something you liked as well. I might do more of those in the future. And as always, if you liked it, please consider subscribing if you haven't. And I hope you have a great weekend and a great rest of your day. From my space to yours.